Welcome back, everybody, to Sign of the Crimes podcast. If you're new here on this podcast, we discuss a new crime every week and signs that could have predicted it. All right, guys, this was a new crime for me this week. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, though. This is Jean Harris and the murder of Dr. Tarnower. Jean Harris was born Jean Struven in 1923, April 27th, in Cleveland, USA. Her mother and father both worked. Her mother, Mildred, was a Christian researcher, and her father, Albert, the main provider, was a civil engineer. Although her father, Albert, was very successful and well-respected, at home, it was a totally different story. Her father, Albert, often compared her to her sister, Mary Margaret, saying that Mary Margaret was perfect and she was not. Her father was described as being a snob and a bigot. He had a bad temper and was always set off by minor inconveniences, which is not always good when you have children, right, guys? Her father was taking out his own disappointment on his children. One of Jean's oldest friends recounts her father as being cold and impossible to please. On the other hand, her mother taught her to be kind to everybody, no matter their wealth or success. In elementary school, Jean studied well and was very well liked, especially by her teachers, who she looked up to. However, this did create distance between her peers. One peer is quoted saying, "I never could be fond of Jean because she was never interested in clothes or style or boys." She was extremely involved in school activities, and she went on to attend Smith College in Massachusetts. She became very involved in college there as well. There is where she met Jim Harris. She would go on to marry Jim Harris, although her father disapproved heavily. She found that she was more so marrying Jim to make her father angry than for love. She was quoted by saying she preferred Jim over her father because Jim was quiet and passive and she could tell him what to do most of the time. However, they did get divorced in 1965, but this was not before having 2 children together. Now, this is where our real story begins. Shortly after her divorce with Jim, she met Dr. Herman Tarnower. They met in the early 1970s, and their initial meeting happened because of mutual connection, which was a friend of Jean Harris's. According to reports, Harris was introduced to Tarnower at a dinner party in New York where he was from. At the time, Jean was successful and well-regarded headmistress at the Madeira School, and Dr. Tarnower was a very accomplished cardiologist, well known for his book, The Scarsdale Diet, which you might recognize. Although the relationship started off as a friendship, it gradually developed into a romantic affair. Jean, despite her success in her professional life, was described as feeling somewhat insecure and lonely and not fulfilled with her life. Dr. Tarnower was attractive, charming, and a somewhat elusive figure. He was known to have a number of other relationships during his time with Jean, which obviously created tension with them. However, Jean and Dr. Tarnower did quickly get engaged. However, after taking time to think, Tarnower changed his mind and decided he doesn't want to be tied down yet. Consequently, Jean threw herself completely into work. However, Jean did still rely on him for one thing. Jean experienced chronic back pain her whole life, and Tarnower would provide her with painkillers, which we now know as meth. Jean was so desperate to keep Tarnower, she decided that marriage was not that important to her, and essentially they could see each other on a limited schedule, aka when Tarnower was free. Although Jean and Tarnower agreed to see each other casually and when they could, they both had different interpretations. Tarnower took this as permission to see other women and date around like he always done. However, Jean did not see it like that. This open relationship took a huge toll on Jean. Although Jean tried to convince herself she was okay with the situation, she was not. During this casual relationship, Tarnower proposed to 2 different women, and after doing that, he would call Jean up and say, "Hey, I just proposed to them." During this time, Tarnower also had a very serious relationship with Lynn Triforos. There was consistent speculation that Jean and Lynn were in competition for Tarnower's love. It was later revealed that Tarnower actually left both women $200,000 in the event that he passes away. This would become very important information. All right. On the night of March 10th, 1980, Jean Harris drove from her home in Virginia to Dr. Tarnower's home in Purchase, New York. Now, Jean Harris had already called him and asked him if she could come, and he said yes. She shows up around 1 a.m., and she feels deeply hurt by Tarnower's emotional detachment and continuing relationship with other women. So it's 1 a.m., she's hurt, this is not gonna end. Jean arrives at his home. She has a key, so she gets in on her own. She looks around, it's dark, and he appears to be sleeping. So she opens the door, flicks on the lights, sits on his bed, and starts talking. Starts talking about nonsense, nothing very important. He looks over, essentially telling her to be quiet. I want to sleep. Apparently, this led to an argument. The exact details of this conversation is very unclear, but it's widely believed that this argument is what escalated the whole situation. At some point during the confrontation, Jean Harris shot Dr. Tarnower multiple times, killing him. This happened after Jean walked into the bathroom and saw a different woman's clothes, presumably Lynn's. Now the maid, Tarnower's maid, was in charge of swapping these women's clothes out when each would leave, so she must have forgotten to do that this night. It was later found out that Jean fired 5 bullets, 4 of them hitting him and 1 of the bullets striking his heart. Harris claimed that she had not meant to kill him, but the situation spiraled out of control. She later said that she brought the gun to his house out of fear and desire to confront him, but insisted she had not intended to kill this man. Apparently, Jean had intended to visit Tarnower and break up with him. After saying her final goodbyes, she would go to the park and commit suicide. This was the story that Jean maintained until the day she died. So what could have possessed a seemingly successful, doting, caring mother, Jean Harris, to commit this brutal act of violence? We're going to discuss multiple theories today, and I want you guys to comment below which one you think caused her to murder someone. The first one is a psychodynamic theory. This theory suggests that unresolved conflicts from early childhood, particularly those ones involving those main caregivers like mothers and fathers, can shape an individual's personality and behavior throughout life. In Jean Harris's case, the critical nature of her father and the emotional neglect she experienced may have caused repressed feelings of anger and frustration and a desire for approval. Her father never saw Jean as an equal and often compared her to Mary Margaret, her perfect sister. Jean could never do anything right in the eyes of her father. Creating this competition in the house, her father often reminded them how much better he was than everyone else. And then seeing people praise their father, she was probably confused, like, these people love him, why am I getting no love from him? This continued into adulthood, where Jean could still never impress him. This could easily be the reason why Jean allowed herself to be treated so horribly by Tarnower and perceived it as love. Jean consistently referred to herself as old baggage and would question why the relationship even lasted that long. Now, the psychodynamic theory might not explain why she was pushed to murder someone, but it could explain why her personality traits forced her to make someone love her who just didn't. She wanted this love from someone who was successful and well-respected and selfish. She liked that he was selfish. Sigmund Freud was the one who did the psychodynamic theory as well, but now we're going to discuss his concept of fixation, which could also be applied in this case. If Jean had not fully resolved her childhood need for approval from her father, she might have sought to find this validation in her adult relationships. Her relationship with Dr. Tarnower could have been an attempt to resolve these unconscious feelings, seeking a form of love or approval that she had never received from her father and not really her mother either. However, because this need for validation was so deeply ingrained in her, her expectations from Dr. Tarnower were honestly unrealistic, and his repeated infidelities and emotional distance would have triggered deep, unresolved childhood wounds. Dr. Tarnower and Jean's father are very similar in nature. They're both successful, selfish men, and these are traits that Jean says she was most attracted to. Don't forget. Since Jean never won her father's desires, she looked at Dr. Tarnower as a second chance, possibly. However, Dr. Tarnower ended up being more like her father than she expected. Jean says her relationship with Tarnower was masochistic love and 14 years of broken promises, just like her childhood. That might be why she let it go on for so long, because in her mind, her childhood went on for so long with her father, and she could have kept trying to gain this love, but no matter how long she did it, she would have never gotten the love from Tarnower or her father. She also said that Tarnower kept her in control by threatening her with banishment. She said in a letter, "I stay home while you make love with the women who is destroying you." She says, I have been publicly humiliated again and again. Her emotional response to these unmet needs, jealousy, anger, and a feeling of betrayal, might have led to the tragic act of violence, as she sought to regain control over her life and the relationship in a moment of emotional turmoil. We're going to come back to that and try and see if Jean's relationship with her father could not only explain her different personality traits, but maybe how she learned to respond to conflict during emotional distress. However, before I do that, I do want to mention the fact that she was going to be left $200,000. Financial motivation is often an indicator when there is a murder case of someone killing their lover or husband. So that could have also been a motivation for her. However, it's very unlikely because she was very successful on her own. So we already went over how Jean's dad treated her horribly, thought he was better, selfish, all that good stuff. But we know that affected her personality. But does that affect how she responds to conflict? If her father was critical and distant, Jean might not have learned healthy coping mechanisms or conflict resolution skills. Instead, she might have learned to internalize anger, frustrations, and feeling of inadequacy, which she later expressed in her other relationships with men. However, Jean was a caring mother, and Jim, her ex-husband, never reported any previous violence, so this behavior was very out of the ordinary for Jean. However, we do have to mention Jim Harris was never like her father. Actually, she liked Jim because he was the opposite of her father. So the fact that there was no violence in that relationship is actually an indicator that Tarnower's behavior, similar to her father's, is what triggered these actions. Again, this might explain why in the face of Dr. Tarnower's emotional neglect and betrayal, Jean reacted with such extreme violence. She may have learned from childhood that anger and emotional intensity were the ways to cope with rejection, even if it meant taking extreme actions. There's a high chance that since her father was so successful, he did experience rejection, and there's a chance that she saw in the household how he reacted to that, because men like that aren't used to being told no or being rejected. So that's a high possibility. This could also be the reason why she threw herself into work. Jean was known to be a caring mother, and Jim, again, her previous husband, reported never any violence, and that she actually worked extremely hard trying to impress her family, her father, herself. She wanted to prove to herself that she could be better than her sister. The self-control theory was initially introduced in a book, The General Theory of Crime, by Michael Godsfredson and Travis Harishi. Now, I would say having good self-control is the biggest indicator that you won't be a criminal because, for example, peer pressure, gangs, drugs, all of those things, if you have self-control, there's a chance that you'll say no to all of those things and figure it out on your own, find healthier coping mechanisms. However, the central idea is that children who are raised in environments whose parents are attached, supervise their behavior, acknowledge when they lack self-control, and apply consistent punishments for deviant acts, are more likely to have developed healthy self-control mechanisms. These children, in turn, are less likely to engage in delinquent behaviors. It appears that Jean was mostly left to fend for herself in her childhood, leaving the development of self-control in her own hands. Now, no matter who Jean Harris was as a child, it is never the child's responsibility to develop their own self-control mechanisms, especially if she saw her father not have self-control and not demonstrate that. She might have seen this as what self-control is. Self-control is reacting with violence, being a snob, a bigot, all of this. Now, I do also want to touch on some mental health reasons why she might have committed this murder. So going back in time, when Jean Harris first gave birth to her children in 1952, early 1950s, she did experience postpartum depression, and her friends said that she was never the same after. Now, we also know that she had chronic back pain her whole life, and she was getting these pills, what we now know as meth, from Dr. Tarnower. So, is there a chance that this meth and these painkillers were drawing her towards Tarnower? The fact that he could care for her and provide for her and make her feel better? So when those things were taken away, she also felt that he was taking away her health. And all of these theories, it goes to show that Jean was not in the right state of mind. Just like her childhood, she was put in a competition against Lynn and against all these other women that Dr. Tarnower was with. So, do you guys believe that she intended to kill him? Or was her plan all along to kill herself and say goodbye, but the situation went awry? This was Sign of the Crimes. See you next week.